In February 2005, the snow outside the Hot 97 radio station was stained red with blood following a terrifying shootout between America's two biggest hip-hop powers. An associate of the game was shot during the chaos outside Hot 97, violently shattering the public image of unity surrounding the G-Unit empire. This bloody tragedy is the most ruthless answer to how the billion-dollar Interscope machine exploited the blood of 50 Cent and the game. Rather than publicly de-escalating the crisis, the corporate machine benefited from the violence and the publicity it generated. This brutal civil war exposed a chilling truth. Corporate power can profit from artist conflict even when the personal consequences become dangerously real. But the blueprint for this bloodshed was drafted long before the triggers were pulled. How did two men who had just spent the previous year filming music videos together, referring to each other as brothers in arms, end up in a shootout? The answer lies in the deeply flawed corporate mandated marriage that brought them together. We must rewind to the early 2000s. American hip-hop was an industry still nursing a profound psychological wound. The tragic, unsolved murders of Tupac Shakur and the notorious B.I.G. in the late 1990s had left the throne empty. The genre was lacking a definitive global superstar who possessed both undeniable lyrical genius and absolute, unquestionable street authenticity. The major record labels were desperately searching for a savior. They found their perfect asset in Curtis James Jackson III, known globally as 50 Cent. Raised in the punishing, unforgiving environment of South Jamaica, Queens, 50 Cent was a survivor in the most literal sense of the word. In the year 2000, he sat in a car outside his grandmother's house and was shot 9 times at point-blank range. Bullets tore through his hand, his arm, his hip, his legs, his chest, and his face. The physical recovery was a medical miracle, but the psychological transformation was absolute. The trauma did not just leave scars on his skin. It forged a psychological armor that made him utterly ruthless. When the man who walked out of that hospital entered the music industry, he did not view it as a creative community. He viewed it as a hostile corporate takeover. By the time Eminem and Dr. Dre brought him into the aftermath Interscope system, 50 Cent had already established G-Unit as both a crew and a brand. He did not run G-Unit like a musical collective. 50 Cent ran G-Unit through a rigid loyalty code, and that leadership style made conflict within the camp almost inevitable. He treated the music business with a cold, calculating pragmatism. His debut album, Get Rich or Die Trying, did not just break sales records. It shifted the cultural tectonic plates. He became one of the most bankable artists in the world and the dominant commercial force in East Coast rap. On the opposite side of the country, the West Coast rap scene was desperate for a revival. It had been years since the golden era of Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre's The Chronic, and Interscope Records, led by the incredibly shrewd industry veteran Jimmy Iovine, wanted to capture that highly lucrative market. Their scouts found the answer in Jason Terrell Taylor, known to the streets as The Game. Hailing from Compton, California, The Game was a genuine product of gang culture. He was widely associated with the Cedar Block Piru Bloods and openly built that identity into his public image. His origin story eerily mirrored that of 50 Cent. Late one night in 2001, intruders kicked in the door of his apartment and opened fire. The Game was shot 5 times and left for dead, spending 3 days in a coma. When he awoke staring at the sterile ceiling of the hospital ward, he made a decision to leave the drug trade behind. He dedicated his life to studying the legends of hip-hop, determined to carry the heavy legacy of the West Coast on his shoulders. He was deeply authentic, fiercely proud, and fundamentally driven by the rigid, unyielding codes of street respect. Dr. Dre signed the game to Aftermath, intending to take his time, mold the young artist in the studio, and carefully craft him into the undisputed new king of the West Coast. But Jimmy Iovine was not a man who liked to wait. Building an artist from the ground up takes years of financial investment and patience. Iovine saw a highly profitable shortcut. Rather than spending years building the game's profile, the executives decided to forcibly merge their two biggest assets. The label aligned the game with 50 Cent and the G-Unit brand as part of a strategy to accelerate his rise. From a purely corporate boardroom perspective, it was a stroke of absolute genius. From a label perspective, it was a calculated commercial alliance. You combine the unstoppable, aggressive East Coast dominance of 50 Cent with the authentic, gang-affiliated West Coast grit of the game. You merge their fan bases, you cross-pollinate the markets, you monopolize the entire rap industry, and you print money. It looked flawless on a spreadsheet. However, from a human perspective, it was a recipe for catastrophe. The executives in their glass towers entirely ignored the psychology of the men they were manipulating. They were dealing with two highly volatile, deeply traumatized alpha males. 50 Cent was a man who demanded total obedience. He needed to be the smartest, most powerful man in the room. The game was a man whose gang affiliation and street survival meant he bowed to no one. You cannot put a militant dictator and a proud, unyielding gang member in the same room and expect them to share the crown. But the corporation cared only about the quarterly earnings report. They forced the men into the same corner, locked the door, and waited for the cash to roll in. The friction began almost immediately during the recording sessions for the game's debut album, The Documentary. Interscope directed 50 Cent to assist with the songwriting. 50 Cent possessed an unparalleled, almost mathematical genius for crafting incredibly catchy melodic hooks. He was instrumental in creating the massive chart-topping hits How We Do and Hate It or Love It. The songs were undeniably brilliant, dominating global radio and club scenes. But behind the soundproof glass of the vocal booths, a toxic resentment was curdling. 50 Cent approached the collaboration entirely as a business transaction. He felt he was doing all the heavy lifting. In his eyes, he was taking an unknown rookie and handing him a platinum-plated career on a silver platter. Because he was providing the hit records, 50 Cent expected profound gratitude and, more importantly, total subservience. He expected the game to act like a loyal foot soldier of the G-Unit Army. The game, however, saw himself as an equal partner. He was certainly grateful for the musical chemistry and the platform, but he refused to be treated as a subordinate. He was a West Coast heavyweight collaborating with an East Coast heavyweight. The fundamental difference in their worldviews violently collided over the issue of industry rivalries. By late 2004, 50 Cent was locked in bitter, highly personal disputes with several prominent New York rappers, including Fat Joe, Jadakiss, and the legendary Nas. Because he was at war with them, 50 Cent demanded that the game attack them as well. He expected his new soldier to disrespect them in interviews and record diss tracks against them. But the game flatly refused to play the pawn. He was trying to establish his own legacy and respect the elders of the genre. He publicly stated in interviews that he had absolutely no issues with Fat Joe, Jadakiss, or Nas, and even expressed a desire to work with them in the future. To a civilian, this sounds like professional maturity. But to 50 Cent, a man whose entire empire was built on a foundation of us versus them, this was an act of high treason. In the militant structure of G-Unit, fraternizing with the enemy was unforgivable. If you are not shooting at the people 50 Cent is shooting at, you are a traitor. The tension simmered behind closed doors, while Interscope Records gleefully tallied the massive pre-orders for the documentary. The label executives knew the two men despised each other. The studio engineers saw the arguments. The A&R representatives felt the icy silence in the hallways, but no one intervened. The label needed the album to drop. They needed the illusion of the invincible G-Unit brotherhood to hold together just long enough to cash the checks. They built a pressure cooker, sealed the lid tight, and turned up the heat, entirely unconcerned about who would be standing in the blast radius when it finally detonated. When the documentary was released in January 2005, it was a monumental success. It debuted at number 1, selling over 500,000 copies in its first week. The game was instantly propelled to global superstardom, but this colossal success triggered a catastrophic shift in the power dynamic. 50 Cent could not tolerate the idea that the man he viewed as his subordinate was now sharing his spotlight. The corporate meddling of Interscope Records then poured petrol onto the smoldering fire. 50 Cent's own highly anticipated sophomore album, The Massacre, was scheduled for release. But the label executives, terrified that two massive releases from the same camp would cannibalize each other's sales, made a ruthless executive decision. The release strategy deepened the tension, especially because 50 Cent felt the label was giving the game room to dominate the market first. For a man of 50 Cent's militant pride, this was not just a scheduling change. It was a profound act of corporate disrespect. He felt his own label was prioritizing a disloyal rookie over the general who had built their empire. The resentment boiled over. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation. 50 Cent decided that if the label would not discipline the game, he would do it himself in the most public, humiliating way possible. He booked an interview at Hot 97, knowing that millions of people in New York and beyond would be listening. He walked into the studio not to promote an album, but to execute a public execution. He was about to light the match that would burn the G-Unit empire to the ground, and the executives at Interscope were perfectly positioned to sell the ashes. Looking back at the genesis of this civil war, the true antagonist is the invisible hand of the corporation. Interscope Records viewed 50 Cent and the game not as young men trying to navigate fame and trauma, but as highly combustible chemicals. They poured them into the same beaker, knowing perfectly well that an explosion was inevitable. In the twisted alchemy of the music industry, explosions create heat, and heat sells records. The executives didn't care that they were dealing with real gangs, real guns, and real lives. They were banking on it. by treating two hardened, traumatized men as nothing more than lines on a balance sheet. The label guaranteed that blood would eventually be spilled. They set the trap, baited it with millions of dollars, and waited for the pride of the streets to do the rest. As the winter of 2005 closed in, the fuse they had so carefully lit finally reached the powder keg. The doors of the Hot 97 radio station in Manhattan did not just represent the entrance to a broadcasting booth. In the early 2000s, they were the absolute epicenter of hip-hop culture. Hot 97 was the town square of New York rap. What was said on those airwaves dictated the undisputed narrative of the streets. When 50 Cent walked into that building on the evening of February 28, 2005, accompanied by his heavy security detail and the remaining loyalists of G Unit, he understood the power of the platform he was about to command. He was not there to promote an upcoming tour or to debut a new single. He was there to perform a public execution. Sitting across from DJ Funkmaster Flex, a legendary broadcaster whose show was treated as the nightly gospel for millions of listeners, 50 Cent was cold, deliberate, and entirely devoid of mercy. For weeks, the internal friction between him and the game had been carefully hidden from the public by the executives at Interscope Records, masked by the massive chart success of the documentary. But 50 Cent was a man whose ego could not tolerate sharing the throne with a subordinate he felt he had built. He was furious that the game had publicly refused to engage in his bitter personal feuds with other New York rappers. In 50 Cent's militant worldview, this was not just a difference of professional opinion, it was an act of profound disloyalty. And in the empire of G Unit, disloyalty was punished with absolute destruction. With the red on-air light glowing, 50 Cent leaned into the microphone and dropped the guillotine. He announced to New York City and to the millions of fans listening globally that he was officially expelling the game from G Unit. He did not merely state that they were parting ways creatively. He systematically attempted to obliterate the game's credibility. 50 Cent claimed that he had written the game's biggest hit records, painting the Compton rapper as a talentless fraud who owed his entire existence, his wealth, and his platform to 50's charity. He mocked the game's refusal to participate in rap feuds, labeling him a coward who lacked the stomach for real warfare. "He's gone," 50 Cent declared, his voice flat and unapologetic. "He's no longer a part of the G Unit camp. I'm not working with him anymore." To fully comprehend the sheer magnitude and danger of this broadcast, one must understand the unyielding psychology of street culture. In the corporate world, if you are fired from a job, you pack your desk and update your resume. But the game was not a corporate employee. He was a documented, affiliated member of the Cedar Block Piru Bloods. For a man whose entire identity, survival, and brand were built on absolute authenticity and street respect, being publicly humiliated and branded a coward on the most influential radio station in the country is not an insult you can ignore. It is a direct, visceral threat to your manhood and your life. In the unforgiving environment of Compton where the game was raised, if you allow another man to publicly strip you of your dignity without consequence, you immediately become prey. By a twist of fate, or perhaps tragic synchronicity, the game and his own heavily armed entourage were also in New York City that evening. They were scattered across hotel rooms and recording studios when the broadcast went live. Mobile phones began to ring frantically. The news of the radio interview spread through the game's camp like a shock wave. The reaction was instantaneous and absolute. There was no consultation with publicists or managers. There was no drafting of a defensive press release. This was a declaration of war, and the response was dictated entirely by the code of the streets. A convoy of black SUVs tore through the freezing, snow-lined Manhattan streets, heading straight downtown for the Hot 97 building on Hudson Street. Their arrival made it clear that the conflict had already moved beyond radio and into a dangerously physical space. When the game's entourage arrived at the radio station, the scene instantly devolved into a chaotic, terrifying standoff. The building's security, suddenly faced with a furious, highly agitated group of men demanding entry to the upper floors, immediately locked down the lobby. But 50 Cent's extended crew was still inside the building, and the friction between the two deeply paranoid, adrenaline-fueled camps was impossible to contain. The confrontation could not be kept behind closed doors. It spilled out of the lobby and onto the icy pavement of Hudson Street. Words were violently exchanged. Insults and threats cut through the freezing night air. The tension was so thick, it was suffocating. These were men who had been raised in environments where disputes were not settled with mediation, but with hollow point ammunition. The corporate veneer of Interscope records, the million-dollar music videos, the tailored suits, the polished magazine covers, evaporated in an instant. What remained was the raw, unvarnished reality of the streets that the label had so happily commodified and packaged for suburban consumption. And then the invisible line was crossed. The sharp, deafening crack of a 9mm pistol shattered the shouting. Panic erupted. The street turned into a war zone, men scattered, diving behind parked cars, and running down the avenues as the echo of the gunshot bounced off the Manhattan skyscrapers. In the midst of the chaos, a 24-year-old man named Kiwi, and Reed collapsed onto the snow-covered pavement. Reed was a close associate of the game, a man who had traveled with him from Compton to share in the success of the music business. Now, a bullet had ripped through his leg. Blood poured from the wound, spreading into a stark, terrifying crimson stain against the white snow. As sirens began to wail in the distance and heavily armed NYPD cruisers rushed toward Hudson Street, the grim reality of the situation locked into place. The manufactured, boardroom-designed alliance of G-Unit had just ended in actual, physical bloodshed. The bullet that struck Kevin Reed did not just pierce flesh, it shattered the fragile, cynical illusion that corporate America could safely control the violence it so eagerly profited from. The theater was over. The war had begun. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, as paramedics loaded a bleeding man into the back of an ambulance and detectives taped off the crime scene, you would expect a massive corporate intervention. You would expect the billionaire executives at Interscope Records, men like Jimmy Iovine, to panic. In any normal industry, if two factions of the same company engage in a shootout on a city street, operations are immediately halted. You would expect the label to freeze all promotional campaigns, issue desperate public apologies, and force their artists into a room with mediators before the retaliation escalated into a morgue. There was no visible public intervention from Interscope that matched the scale of the crisis. The silence from the corporate boardrooms was not a sign of shock. It was a sign of calculated, predatory opportunism. The shooting outside Hot 97 was the ultimate, unbuyable marketing campaign. Within minutes, the news was dominating every television network, radio station, and music website on the planet. MTV News interrupted its regular programming to provide rolling, wall-to-wall coverage of the East Coast versus West Coast gang war that had just erupted in the streets of New York. The narrative was utterly perfect for the media and the label. It was the invulnerable, ruthless warlord of Queens pitted against the betrayed, vengeful gangster of Compton. It was a real-life mob movie playing out in real time. The public did not turn away in horror. They leaned in with morbid fascination. And Interscope Records owned the exclusive rights to the soundtrack. The timing of the shootout was so commercially advantageous that it borders on the grotesque. Just 3 days after the blood stained the snow on Hudson Street on March 3, 2005, 50 Cent's highly anticipated sophomore album, The Massacre, was released to the public. The executives knew exactly what they were doing. They did not delay the release out of respect for the victim or fear of further violence. They pushed it forward. The public, utterly captivated by the real-world danger and the promise of violent, lyrical retaliation, rushed to record stores in their millions. They weren't just buying a compact disc, they were buying a front-row ticket to a blood feud. They wanted to hear the anger. They wanted to dissect every lyric, looking for hidden insults, desperate to pick sides in a war that had suddenly become terrifyingly real. The sales figures that followed were staggering, almost incomprehensible. The Massacre sold an astonishing 1.14 million copies in its first week alone, becoming one of the fastest-selling albums in the history of the music industry. It was a monumental financial triumph. Simultaneously, the sales of the games The Documentary, which had already been sitting at the top of the charts, experienced a massive secondary surge. The controversy acted as a supercharger for both projects. The executives sat in their climate-controlled boardrooms, watching the revenue climb to unprecedented astronomical heights. They were perfectly insulated from the police interrogations, the looming death threats, and the suffocating paranoia that had just enveloped their artists. They spent nothing on traditional advertising that week because CNN, MTV, and Fox News were providing hundreds of millions of dollars worth of free publicity through their crime reporting. The label appeared slow to de-escalate the violence, even as the publicity surrounding the feud was clearly fueling commercial momentum. They allowed the hatred to fester. They allowed the gang affiliations to mobilize. They actively weaponized the shootout, knowing that the very real threat of impending death was keeping 50 Cent and the game dominating the global cultural conversation. The blood of Kevin Reed had essentially lubricated the printing presses of Universal Music Group. This is the darkest, most carefully hidden secret of the hardcore rap industry. The corporate machine actively incentivizes the danger it claims to disavow. The executives understand that authenticity is the highest currency in hip-hop. When an artist is perceived as genuinely dangerous, their market value skyrockets. The label treats these young, traumatized men like fighting dogs. They place them in the pit, starve them of respect, and poke them through the chain-link fence until they finally bare their teeth. And when the first bite occurs and the blood begins to flow on the pavement, the executives do not jump into the pit to separate them. They simply turn to the cheering crowd, raise the ticket prices, and watch the slaughter unfold. 50 Cent and the game were now trapped in a cage of their own pride, forced to fight a war that neither of them could truly win without risking their freedom or their lives. They were locked into an escalating cycle of retaliation, driven by street codes that demanded blood for disrespect. Meanwhile, the men who built the cage and locked the doors walked away with the millions. But the physical violence of the street cannot be contained by a marketing plan indefinitely. While the record labels celebrated their historic sales week, the NYPD and the federal authorities were watching the situation with mounting furious alarm. They remembered the bodies of the 1990s. They knew that a war between a Queens Empire and a Compton gang would not stay contained to Hudson Street. It would spread across the country, bleeding into nightclubs, award shows, and concert venues. The authorities were about to force Interscope's hand, leading to one of the most cynical, transparently hollow public relations stunts in the history of the entertainment business. The corporate machine had made its money from the war. Now, it was going to attempt to manufacture a fake peace to avoid the police shutting down the entire industry. The gunshot outside Hot 97 was the exact moment the music stopped, and the terrible mechanical grinding of the corporate machine became deafeningly audible. It exposed the grotesque hypocrisy of an industry that packages street trauma and poverty into digestible, thrilling entertainment for the masses. When the consequences of that trauma manifested in real life, the system did not offer rehabilitation or support. It offered distribution. Interscope records proved that they were perfectly content to fund both sides of a deadly rivalry, funneling the profits of a manufactured war into the same corporate coffers. 50 Cent thought he was defending his absolute authority. The game thought he was defending his undeniable honor. In reality, they were both just providing free, blood-soaked advertising for a corporation that viewed them as entirely expendable assets. The physical shootout had ended that night, but the true war, a grueling, psychologically devastating siege that would isolate both men and tear a billion-dollar empire to shreds, was only just beginning. The blood in the snow on Hudson Street had barely frozen before the grim, terrifying reality of the situation began to cast a long shadow over the entire music industry. In the immediate days following the shootout, the executives at Interscope Records were privately euphoric. They were sitting in their glass towers watching the sales of 50 Cent's The Massacre and the Games, the documentary, obliterate chart records. The shootout had functioned as the most successful, unbuyable advertising campaign in the history of hip-hop. They had successfully monetized attempted murder, turning a violent street clash into a global cultural event. But their corporate celebration was abruptly and forcefully cut short by an entity far more powerful than a billionaire's bottom line, the United States government and the New York Police Department. The authorities were not looking at the Billboard charts. They were looking at a trajectory that mirrored the darkest, most devastating chapter in modern musical history. It had been less than a decade since the East Coast-West Coast rap war had claimed the lives of Tupac Shakur and the notorious B.I.G., leaving two legends dead and a genre permanently scarred. The NYPD, local politicians, and community leaders were terrified that this new, highly publicized eruption of violence between the undisputed warlord of Queens and a documented blood from Compton would ignite a nationwide gang war. The police made it explicitly, undeniably clear to the corporate heads at Universal Music Group and Interscope. If the violence escalated any further, the labels would be held directly accountable. The threat from the authorities was existential to the corporate machine. Law enforcement pressure made it clear that the feud could have serious consequences for touring, promotion, and public-facing business. The entire multi-million-dollar touring infrastructure, which relied heavily on municipal permits and local law enforcement cooperation, would be systematically dismantled. Faced with the sudden, terrifying prospect of having their money printing machine confiscated by the state, the executives who had so happily watched the tension boil over suddenly decided to play the role of peacemakers. They didn't intervene out of a moral obligation to protect their artists' lives, nor did they care about the safety of the young men in the entourages. They intervened strictly to protect their profit margins. Jimmy Iovine and the corporate brass orchestrated what remains one of the most cynical, transparently hollow public relations stunts in the history of the entertainment business. They demanded an immediate televised peace treaty. On March 9th, 2005, just over a week after the bullets flew outside Hot 97, 50 Cent and The Game were forced to appear together at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem. The location itself was a highly calculated, deeply manipulative choice by the corporate publicists. It was a historic institution dedicated to African American heritage and civil rights, chosen specifically to lend an air of solemnity, maturity, and cultural importance to what was in reality a corporate hostage situation. The atmosphere inside the Schomburg Center that afternoon was thick with an excruciating, suffocating tension. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with journalists, photographers, and nervous label executives who hovered in the background, like anxious wardens, making sure their prisoners did not step out of line. 50 Cent and The Game walked onto the stage. They did not look like two men who had experienced a revelation of brotherhood. They looked like two apex predators, calculating the optimal angle to slit each other's throats the moment the cameras were turned off. Their body language spoke volumes, betraying the meticulously drafted statements they held in their hands. 50 Cent wore a tight, uncomfortable smirk, exuding the arrogant confidence of a man who knew he held the ultimate leverage with the record label. The Game stood stiffly, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle feathered in his cheek, his eyes radiating a cold, suppressed fury. He was a proud man from the streets of Compton being forced to publicly capitulate by men in expensive suits. They stepped up to the podium and recited the lines that had been carefully drafted by high-priced crisis management teams and corporate lawyers. They announced a permanent truce. They shook hands, a brief, lifeless collision of palms that lacked an ounce of genuine warmth or forgiveness. The corporation even announced the creation of a foundation, pledging financial contributions to youth programs in Compton and Queens. It was a classic, transparent corporate tactic. Throw a fraction of the profits at a charity to buy public goodwill and appease the civic leaders who were threatening to shut down the circus. 50 and I are proving that real situations and real problems can be solved with real talk. The Game read from his statement, his voice flat and entirely devoid of conviction. 50 Cent followed suit, speaking of setting a positive example for the youth and moving forward as businessmen. The flashes of 100 cameras captured the historic handshake. The executives sighed in profound relief. The police backed off, satisfied that the corporations had taken responsibility. The evening news cycles praised the maturity and growth of the two artists. But anyone who understood the unyielding psychology of the streets knew they were watching a pantomime. You cannot erase a public humiliation on primetime radio with a charitable donation. You cannot unfire a bullet that tore through a man's leg by shaking hands in a museum. The code of the Cedar Block Pirates and the militant, unforgiving dictatorship of G Unit do not recognize corporate press releases. The moment the press conference ended, the cameras were packed away, and the two men retreated to their separate, heavily armored SUVs. The manufactured truce evaporated into the Manhattan air. The hatred had not been extinguished. It had simply been forced underground, where it began to mutate into something far more toxic, enduring, and ultimately destructive. The corporate machine had secured its immediate investments and pacified the police, but behind closed doors, a brutal restructuring of the empire was taking place. Interscope Records, realizing that the two men could never share a studio, a stage, or even a city again without the imminent threat of gunfire, was forced to make a definitive choice. They had to choose between 50 Cent, the established global icon whose new album was selling over 1 million copies a week, and The Game, the rising star who had just delivered a classic debut. In the cold, ruthless calculus of the music business, loyalty means absolutely nothing and revenue dictates everything. Interscope sided with 50 Cent. The corporate excommunication of The Game was swift, clinical, and devastating. He was officially and permanently stripped of his G-Unit branding, the iconic logo that he had proudly tattooed on his body, a symbol of his allegiance to what he had believed was an impenetrable brotherhood, was now a permanent, mocking reminder of his betrayal and exile. But the punishment extended far beyond the removal of a logo on an album cover. The executives effectively severed The Game's access to the legendary producer who had discovered him, mentored him, and validated him, Dr. Dre. For a rapper from Compton, losing the backing of Dr. Dre is akin to being musically orphaned. Dre was the sonic architect of the West Coast. He provided the legitimacy, the perfectionism, and the monumental beats that guaranteed classic status. Interscope and 50 Cent made it unequivocally clear that Dre could not produce for both sides of a civil war. Faced with immense corporate pressure to protect the 50 Cent asset, and perhaps wishing to avoid being dragged into the center of a violent gang conflict, Dr. Dre stepped back. The Game was cast out of the Aftermath Entertainment inner circle. He was exiled, left to fend for himself in an industry that was suddenly terrified to associate with him for fear of angering the vindictive, immensely powerful 50 Cent. The executives at Interscope fully expected The Game to fade into obscurity. They assumed that without 50 Cent's undeniable melodic hooks, without Dr. Dre's pristine production, and without the massive billion-dollar promotional engine of the G-Unit machine behind him, the Compton rookie would quietly disappear. They viewed him as a casualty of a war he could not possibly win, a disposable asset that had outlived its usefulness the moment it threatened the primary cash cow. They fundamentally underestimated the sheer terrifying resilience of a man who had survived 5 gunshot wounds. Realizing that the corporate system had locked the doors, turned off the lights, and left him for dead, The Game reverted to the only survival tactics he knew: guerrilla warfare. He could not fight 50 Cent in the boardrooms. He did not have the executive leverage or the institutional backing. So he took the war back to the pavement. He launched one of the most aggressive, relentless, and exhaustive smear campaigns in the history of hip-hop. He single-handedly coined and weaponized the movement G-U-Not, a direct mocking subversion of the empire's name. He did not rely on radio play or corporate marketing budgets. He went grassroots. He printed hundreds of thousands of G-U-Not t-shirts and distributed them freely at concerts, in neighborhoods, and from the trunks of cars across the country. He encouraged fans at his shows to chant the slogan, turning entire arenas into anti-50 Cent rallies. He was determined to dismantle the mythology of invincibility that 50 Cent had so carefully constructed. The psychological warfare peaked with a barrage of mixtapes distributed outside the purview of the major record labels. The game understood the psychology of hip-hop culture intimately. He knew that the ultimate weapon against a man who brands himself an untouchable, terrifying gangster is public mockery. He didn't just attack 50 Cent with threats of violence. He attacked him with humor, profound disrespect, and an unyielding persistence. He systematically broke down the credibility of every single member of 50 Cent's crew. He mocked their tough guy personas. He mocked their album sales. He mocked their blind allegiance to a man who treated them like disposable foot soldiers. This relentless street-level assault began to inflict catastrophic damage on the G-Unit brand. Before the Civil War, wearing G-Unit clothing, trainers, or accessories was a symbol of absolute status and street credibility. It was an apparel empire that rivaled established global fashion brands. But the game's campaign managed to do the impossible. He made G-Unit deeply uncool in core hip-hop circles. In neighborhoods from Los Angeles to New York, wearing the logo suddenly became an invitation for ridicule. Sales plummeted. The cultural cachet that 50 Cent had spent years cultivating in the streets began to rapidly evaporate. The game, the man cast out by the billionaires, had managed to strike his former mentor in the only place that truly mattered to the corporate machine, the bottom line. But as the GU-Not movement gained fierce momentum, a terrifying transformation began to take place within the inner sanctum of 50 Cent's empire. As the external pressure and public mockery from the game intensified, 50 Cent's need for absolute tyrannical control over his own crew mutated into a suffocating paranoia. The warlord was watching his fortress being chipped away, and the psychological toll on both men and everyone caught in their orbit was about to plunge the industry into an era of unprecedented isolation, fear, and musical stagnation. The corporate executives had successfully separated the fighters to appease the police, but they had inadvertently unleashed a Cold War that would consume the prime years of their greatest assets. The Schomburg Center press conference remains the ultimate symbol of corporate hypocrisy in modern music history. It was a grotesque theater of a absurd, where billionaires forced two men who desperately wanted to kill each other to smile for the cameras, purely to keep the supply chain moving and the police at bay. By exiling the game, stripping him of Dr. Dre and backing 50 Cent, Interscope Records believed they had neatly solved the problem. They had protected their primary asset, discarded the troublesome variable, and washed their hands of the violence. But they failed to understand that trauma and street pride cannot be neatly filed away in a corporate dossier. By abandoning the game, they did not silence him, they radicalized him. They forced him into a corner where his only option for survival was to burn the entire house down. The physical shootout outside Hot 97 had ended, but the true war, a grueling, psychologically devastating siege that would isolate both men behind bulletproof glass and tear a billion-dollar empire to shreds, was entering its most destructive phase. The label had successfully trapped two titans in a cage match of their own design, and the world was about to watch them tear each other apart, one mixtape at a time. The fragile, corporate-mandated truce signed at the Schomburg Center was nothing more than a temporary ceasefire designed entirely for the cameras. Behind the scenes, the executives at Interscope Records were executing a brutal, calculated restructuring of their assets. They had definitively chosen 50 Cent over the game, effectively exiling the Compton rapper from the G-Unit empire and stripping him of Dr. Dre's legendary production. To the public, to the media, and to the streets, it appeared that the game had been cast out into the wilderness to die. The industry consensus was unanimous and unforgiving. You cannot survive a war against 50 Cent, and you certainly cannot survive a hip-hop career without the backing of Dr. Dre and the Interscope machine. But this is where the sheer, unadulterated cynicism of the music business reveals its darkest, most manipulative lay. The narrative of the game being a corporate outcast was, in reality, a carefully managed illusion. The executives at Universal Music Group, the monolithic parent company that owned Jimmy Iovine's Interscope Records, had absolutely no intention of losing their grip on a multi-platinum, globally recognized artist. They knew the feud was the most lucrative marketing engine in the world, so they engaged in a masterful piece of corporate sleight of hand. They did not drop the game from their roster. They simply moved his paperwork. Although he was publicly pushed out of the G-Unit structure, the game remained within the broader Universal system through Geffen. Geffen was another subsidiary fully owned and operated under the exact same Universal Music Group umbrella. The executives essentially moved the warring factions into two different departments within the same corporation. They allowed 50 Cent to believe he had successfully banished his enemy from his label, and they allowed the game to cultivate a fierce, anti-establishment underdog persona. In reality, every time 50 Cent sold an album fueled by his hatred for the game, and every time the game sold a mixtape fueled by his hatred for 50 Cent, the massive profits were funneled upwards into the exact same corporate bank accounts. The label had successfully monetized a deadly gang war on two separate balance sheets. Unaware or uncaring of the corporate shell game taking place above him, the game was fighting for his musical life. The transfer to Geffen Records meant he was legally barred from using the G-Unit branding, and more devastatingly, he was cut off from the Aftermath entertainment infrastructure. He was a West Coast rapper who had just lost the undisputed godfather of West Coast rap. 50 Cent, acutely aware of his immense power and furious that his rival had not been entirely destroyed, immediately weaponized his industry dominance. He imposed a severe, unyielding embargo on the game. He issued a draconian, an ultimatum to the rest of the music industry. Anyone who collaborated with the game, whether providing a feature verse, a chorus, or producing a beat, would be considered a sworn enemy of 50 Cent and the G-Unit empire. This was not an empty threat. 50 Cent had a terrifying, proven track record of destroying the careers of those who crossed him. He possessed the influence to blacklist producers from highly lucrative projects, to pull his own chart-topping features from other artists' albums, and to unleash a relentless barrage of public mockery on anyone he deemed disloyal. It was an industry-wide reign of terror. Prominent artists backed away from the game in fear. Scheduled studio sessions were abruptly canceled by managers terrified of the Queen's warlord. The game found himself operating in a quarantined zone, surrounded by a silent, invisible blockade constructed by a man who had sworn to end his career. For a lesser artist, this profound isolation would have been a death sentence. The public and the music press expected the game to release a lackluster, disjointed second album. They assumed that without the pristine cinematic sheen of Dr. Dre's production and the undeniable radio-friendly hooks of 50 Cent, the Compton rookie would falter. They expected the G-Unit machine to steamroll him into obscurity, but they fundamentally underestimated the sheer, terrifying resilience of a man forged in the brutal gang culture of Compton. The game did not succumb to the pressure. He weaponized his isolation. He channeled his fury, his profound sense of betrayal, and his deep-seated desire for vengeance into the creation of his sophomore album. He titled it Doctor's Advocate. The title itself was a calculated, defiant message. He was declaring to the world, and specifically to 50 Cent and the Interscope executives, that he was the true torchbearer of Dr. Dre's legacy, regardless of the corporate excommunication. He didn't need the man in the room. He embodied the raw spirit of the West Coast that Dre had pioneered. Cut off from the primary architects of his debut, the game systematically assembled a coalition of incredibly talented independent producers who were willing to risk the wrath of 50 Cent to be a part of a historic underdog story. He brought in heavyweights like Just Blaze, Scott Storch, Swizz Beatz, Kanye West, and Will.I.Am. The recording sessions were intense, fueled by a frantic, paranoid energy. The game was working with a chip on his shoulder, the size of a mountain. He was desperate to prove that the undeniable genius of his debut album belonged to his own storytelling and authenticity, not just to 50 Cent's melodies or the Interscope machine. Simultaneously, the physical reality of the feud was demanding a far more visceral price. The corporate executives in Universal's boardrooms may have been insulated from the consequences of their actions, but the artists and their entourages were living in a constant, suffocating state of anxiety. The gunshot outside Hot 97 was not an isolated incident. It was a permanent escalation of the stakes. Both men were forced to transform their daily lives into rigorous military operations. The financial cost of their physical security was astronomical. 50 Cent had purchased the sprawling 50,000 square foot mansion in Connecticut, formerly owned by the boxer Mike Tyson. It was not a home, it was a fortress. He equipped it with panic rooms, heavy surveillance cameras covering every inch of the perimeter, and a small private army of armed security guards. He traveled only in convoys of heavily armored bomb-proof SUVs. His public appearances required logistical planning that rivaled a presidential motorcade. The profound trauma of his near-fatal shooting in the year 2000 had never truly left him, and the war with the game pushed that deep-seated paranoia to catastrophic levels. 50 Cent lived in a state of hypervigilance, constantly scanning crowds, forever waiting for the retaliatio, and that the codes of the street demanded. He trusted virtually no one. As the external pressure from the game's relentless GU-Not guerrilla campaign intensified, 50 Cent's need for absolute tyrannical control over his own crew mutated into a toxic, suffocating environment. He viewed the game's continuing survival and success as a personal failure of his own soldiers. He demanded more loyalty, more aggression, and more subservience from the remaining members of G-Unit, Lloyd Banks, Tony Yayo, and Young Buck. But these men were suffering immensely under the crossfire of a war they had not started. They were forced to defend a conflict that was primarily driven by 50 Cent's ego. They were blacklisted from collaborations because of their association with the feud. And worse, they were constantly subjected to 50 Cent's merciless internal policing. If their solo albums did not meet his astronomical commercial expectations, he humiliated them publicly in interviews. If they expressed any desire for creative autonomy, he branded them traitors. The psychological toll of living under a dictator who who was simultaneously fighting a massive external war and actively cannibalizing his own crew, was immense. The most tragic casualty of this internal implosion was young Buck, a wildly talented rapper from Nashville, Tennessee. Young Buck possessed a fierce, authentic Southern energy that had been crucial to G-Unit's nationwide appeal. However, as the feud with the game raged on and the G-Unit apparel brand lost its cultural cachet, young Buck's solo career began to suffer. He expressed deep frustration with the toxic, highly restrictive environment 50 Cent had created. He wanted to reach across the aisle. He wanted to make music without the constant threat of violence. 50 Cent's response to this dissent was not just cruel, it was an act of absolute public destruction. When young Buck attempted to distance himself from the group, 50 Cent did not simply fire him. He sought to ate his dignity. 50 Cent secretly recorded a highly emotional, private telephone conversation in which young Buck, financially strained and psychologically exhausted by the constant warring, was heard crying and pleading with 50 Cent to let him go. 50 Cent then leaked that recording to the public. It was a staggering betrayal of trust, a move designed purely to humiliate a man who had once been a loyal soldier. This act of vindictive cruelty exposed the horrifying reality of the G-Unit empire to the entire world. 50 Cent had spent so long building a fortress to protect himself from his enemies that he had effectively imprisoned himself. He was surrounded only by men he either bullied into submission or publicly destroyed. The civil war with the game had not just cost him millions in apparel sales. It had stripped away the facade of brotherhood that was the very foundation of his brand. The public watched in horror as the supposedly impenetrable unit devoured itself from the inside out. Meanwhile, the game lived an equally militarized existence on the West Coast. His deep ties to the Cedar Block purists meant that any threat to his life from the East Coast was interpreted as a threat to the gang itself. His concerts became high-risk events, heavily monitored by local police gang units and fraught with the potential for sudden, explosive violence. The entourage expanded into a small militia, the weaponry increased, and the mental toll of constantly looking over his shoulder began to warp his creative output. Every lyric, every interview, every public appearance was viewed strictly through the lens of survival. These were two immensely wealthy, globally recognized superstars who were essentially living as prisoners of their own pride. By the middle of the feud, both men had money and fame, but neither of them could move through the world like a truly free person. They had all the money in the world, but they could not walk down the street to buy a cup of coffee without an armed escort. The record label had successfully engineered the most dangerous, highly profitable rivalry in modern music, and they had left the artists to deal with the psychological wreckage. The climax of this grueling, isolating chapter arrived in November 2006 when the game finally released Doctor's Advocate. The album was the ultimate test of his survival. It was the moment of truth that would determine whether the corporate machine and 50 Cent's embargo had successfully destroyed him, or whether he had achieved the impossible. The anticipation in the industry was palpable. 50 Cent and the executives at Interscope waited, fully expecting the album to be a commercial failure, a final definitive proof that the game was nothing without the G-Unit machine. But when the first week sales figures were published by Billboard, the shock wave reverberated through the entire music business. Doctor's Advocate debuted at number 1 on the U.S. Billboard 200 chart, selling nearly 360,000 copies in its first week. It was a staggering, monumental victory. The game had proven that he did not need 50 Cent's hooks. He did not need Dr. Dre's beats. He did not need the backing of the Interscope marketing department to dominate the charts. He had beaten the blockade. He had weaponized his exile, turning his corporate banishment into a narrative of street-level defiance that resonated deeply with millions of fans. The album received widespread critical acclaim, with many critics arguing that it surpassed his debut in terms of lyrical maturity, storytelling, and unadulterated West Coast authenticity. It was a devastating, humiliating blow to 50 Cent's ego, the man he had publicly cast out on Hot 97, the man he had spent years trying to destroy through an industry-wide embargo and a relentless smear campaign, was sitting comfortably at the absolute top of the Billboard charts. The GU Not movement had struck a fatal blow. The illusion of 50 Cent's absolute invincibility was permanently shattered. The dictator of New York had failed to execute the rebel of Compton. Yet, as the champagne corks popped in the game's camp and the executives at Geffen Records celebrated their enormous profit margins, the victory felt deeply hollow. Yes, the game had survived the corporate execution, and yes, 50 Cent was watching his own empire slowly crumble from within. But the war had already consumed the absolute prime years of their lives. They had spent millions of dollars on armed guards and legal fees. They had isolated themselves from their peers. They had exhausted their creative energies on a bitter, unrelenting hatred that had long since lost its initial spark. The corporate machine had won again. Universal Music Group had pitted two titans against each other, watched them tear their respective legacies apart, and seamlessly collected the revenue from both sides of the wreckage. And the most terrifying truth of all was that despite the chart victories and the millions of dollars in their bank accounts, neither man could ever truly lower his guard. The war may have shifted from the radio waves to the record sales, but on the streets the consequences were permanent, and the paranoia was forever. The release of Doctor's Advocate was the definitive turning point in the Civil War. It was the moment the balance of power shifted from the absolute suffocating dictatorship of Queens to the resilient, undeniable defiance of Compton. But the triumph of that album also serves as a profound, tragic indictment of the music industry. The executives at Universal Music Group proved that they were perfectly content to fund a war, funneling the profits of a manufactured, deadly rivalry into the same corporate coffers via different subsidiary labels. They weaponized 50 Cent's need for control and the game's need for respect, turning the artist's deepest psychological traumas against each other. The artists genuinely believed they were fighting for their honor, for their street credibility, for their legacies. In reality, they were fighting for the amusement of men who viewed them as nothing more than highly profitable, entirely expendable gladiators. The GU Not campaign successfully dismantled 50 Cent's untouchable empire, but it also cemented the game's identity as the eternal antagonist. They were trapped in a cycle of mutual destruction, their lives permanently altered by a corporate experiment that went horribly, profitably wrong. The final act of this tragedy would not be written in blood, but in the slow, agonizing realization of what they had both lost. As the years rolled on, the explosive, headline-grabbing violence of 2005 hardened into a bitter, exhausting Cold War. The initial shootout outside Hot 97, the mandated hollow peace treaties in Harlem, and the phenomenal defiant sales of Doctor's Advocate were the seismic shocks, but the tremors would continue to rattle the hip-hop landscape for over a decade. The civil war between 50 Cent and the game transitioned from a high-stakes battle for physical survival into a grueling, relentless war of attrition. But as the 2000s bled into the 2010s, a profound and deeply tragic reality began to dawn on both the artists and the culture that consumed their hatred. The war was no longer driving the culture forward. It was dragging both men backwards. For 50 Cent, the undisputed dictator of the East Coast, the paranoia and the absolute need for control that had fueled his meteoric rise began to systematically dismantle his empire. The GU Not campaign, orchestrated by the game, had inflicted catastrophic, irreversible damage on the G-Unit brand. It had stripped away its cool factor, exposed the cracks in its armor, and proved that the warlord could be made to bleed. But 50 Cent's reaction to this vulnerability was his ultimate undoing. Instead of adapting to a changing musical landscape or attempting to heal the fractures within his own camp, he doubled down on his militancy. He alienated his peers, bullied his own artists into submission, and stubbornly refused to evolve his sound. The definitive turning point, the moment the public finally realized the dictator had lost his grip on the throne, occurred in September 2007. 50 Cent, driven by an ego that had been severely bruised by the game's independent success, decided to engage in a highly publicized, incredibly risky sales battle with Kanye West. They scheduled their new albums, 50 Cent's Curtis and Kanye's Graduation, to be released on the exact same day. 50 Cent arrogantly proclaimed to the media that if Kanye outsold him, he would retire from making solo albums entirely. It was a classic, aggressive G-Unit intimidation tactic. A bet placed on the assumption that the public still craved the bulletproof, hyper-masculine gangsta rap that had defined the early 2000s. But the cultural tide had shifted beneath his feet. Kanye West's vulnerability, electronic beats, and complete departure from traditional street narratives resonated with a new, rapidly expanding generation of hip-hop fans. When the numbers were tallied, Graduation absolutely obliterated Curtis in first-week sales. 50 Cent did not retire, but the defeat was a staggering public humiliation. His aura of invincibility was permanently, undeniably shattered. The dictator had been overthrown, not by a bullet from a rival gang, and not by the game's mixtape assaults, but by a shifting demographic that no longer wanted to buy the trauma that Interscope had spent years packaging. As 50 Cent's musical dominance waned, the G-Unit crew completely fractured. The men he had demanded absolute loyalty from were cast aside, trapped in restrictive contracts, or publicly humiliated by the man they had once called a brother. Recognizing that the musical empire was collapsing, 50 Cent increasingly distanced himself from the recording booth, pivoting his immense undeniable drive towards corporate America. He found staggering success as an entrepreneur. He famously made hundreds of millions of dollars from his minority stake in Vitamin Water when it was purchased by Coca-Cola, and he later forged a massive television empire as the executive producer of the hit series Power. He traded his bulletproof vest for tailored suits, conquering boardrooms with the exact same ruthlessness he had once applied to the streets of South Jamaica. But musically, the empire he had built with his blood was a wasteland. On the West Coast, the game's trajectory was equally complex and fraught with the ghosts of the past. He had survived the corporate execution. He had proven his independence. He released a string of critically acclaimed, highly successful albums, LAX, the RED album, Jesus Piece, solidifying his status as a permanent, undeniable legend of West Coast rap. He carried the torch of Compton with immense pride, collaborating with a new generation of artists and cementing his legacy as a lyricist. Yet psychologically, he was forever shackled to the ghost of his former mentor. For nearly a decade, the Game could not release a project, give a magazine interview, or perform a concert without referencing 50 Cent. He released literally hundreds of diss tracks, expending vast amounts of creative energy shadowboxing a phantom opponent who was no longer even in the ring. It was an obsession born of deep trauma, public humiliation, and betrayed loyalty. The Game was a gladiator who had fought brilliantly to win his freedom, but once the gates were open, he refused to leave the arena. He continued to swing his sword at an opponent who had long since left the building to count his television money. The fans, once captivated by the very real danger of the feud, slowly grew exhausted by the endless repetition. The Civil War had become an archaic relic of a bygone era, a grudge that was actively preventing the Game from fully embracing his own monumental achievements. The immense tragedy of this lost decade lies in the sheer, unimaginable musical potential that was squandered by corporate greed. If you look at the musical chemistry between 50 Cent and the Game on tracks like Hate It or Love It and How We Do, you are looking at the Lennon and McCartney of hardcore hip-hop. 50 Cent possessed an unparalleled genius for crafting melodic, immortal hooks. The Game possessed the raw, authentic storytelling grit of the West Coast. Together, their sound was entirely flawless. Had they been allowed to coexist, had the corporate machine of Interscope Records not forced them into a pressure cooker of paranoia, competition, and greed, they could have released joint albums that would have dominated the industry for a quarter of a century. They left hundreds of millions of dollars and a historic unified cultural legacy on the table. Instead, because Jimmy Iovine and the executives wanted to fast-track their profits, by forcing a hostile merger, the artists spent their physical and creative primes tearing each other's legacies to shreds. The exhaustion of carrying a decade-long grudge eventually outweighs the anger that ignited it. As both men approached their 40s, having survived the streets, survived the lethal machinations of the music industry, and survived each other, the ice finally began to thaw. The climax of this sprawling, blood-soaked epic did not take place in a boardroom, a courtroom, or a radio station. It took place in August 2016 in the neon-lit, chaotic environment of the Ace of Diamonds strip club in Los Angeles. Both 50 Cent and the Game happened to be in the building. A decade earlier, this exact proximity would have guaranteed a shootout. The security teams would have drawn their weapons. The patrons would have fled in terror, and blood would have stained the pavement once again. But on this night, the two men stood face to face. There were no cameras flashing for a corporate press release. There were no executives pulling the strings or drafting statements. There was no Jimmy Iovine forcing them to smile. The Game took a microphone, looked directly at the man he had spent 10 years trying to destroy, and spoke to the crowd. "I bought 50 some bottles," the Game announced, his voice echoing through the club, cutting through the heavy bass of the music. "It's been 10 years. Ain't nobody crossing no lines. We had a feud. We had a beef. It's over with." 50 Cent nodded, a genuine, relaxed smile crossing his face. They exchanged a brief, quiet embrace. It was a staggering moment of closure. It was not a grand cinematic reconciliation. It was the quiet, profound realization of two older men who recognized that they had survived a war they barely remembered the origins of. They had both been young, traumatized, and manipulated by a corporate system that viewed their lives, their gang affiliations, and their pride as completely disposable content. By shaking hands as independent, wealthy, grown men on their own terms and without a corporate sponsor, they finally stripped the machine of its power over them. But as the dust finally settles on one of the most infamous, destructive rivalries in music history, we are forced to zoom out and examine the true victors of this bloodshed. While 50 Cent and the Game were spending millions on armored SUVs, paying exorbitant legal fees, alienating their peers, and living in a constant state of mortal fear, the men who orchestrated the collision were sitting comfortably above the fray. Jimmy Iovine and Dr. Dre, the primary architects of the Interscope empire, did not suffer the paranoia of the feud. They did not have to wear bulletproof vests to the grocery store. They did not have their friends shot in the snow. They simply tallied the monumental, record-breaking profits generated by the massacre and the documentary. While the artists absorbed the violence and psychological fallout, Jimmy Iovine and Dr. Dre went on to build even larger business empires far removed from the chaos of that era. In 2014, I sold beats to Apple for a staggering $3 billion. They moved deeper into elite corporate and technology circles, celebrated as visionary billionaires in entertainment and business. They walked into the sterile, pristine boardrooms of Silicon Valley, leaving the violence of the streets far behind them. They faced no meaningful public accountability for the toxic environment they helped profit from, even as the artists bore the real-world consequences. This is the sinister, highly functioning mechanism of the music industry's darkest niche. It is a system that actively scouts the most dangerous, impoverished neighborhoods in America, looking for young men whose trauma, anger, and gang ties can be monetized. It hands them a microphone, exacerbates their territorial hatreds, and then sells the resulting violence to a global audience desperate for a safe proximity to danger. When the guns are drawn, the label claims they are simply protecting artistic freedom. When the bodies fall, the label issues generic condolences through their PR departments. And when the albums sell, the label keeps the lion's share of the profit, completely insulated from the physical and emotional wreckage left in their wake. The feud between 50 Cent and the Game was not a failure of the system. It was the system operating exactly, perfectly, as it was designed to. It was the absolute, unapologetic weaponization of gang culture by corporate America. Looking back at the freezing night outside Hot 97, where Kevin Reed lay bleeding in the snow, the story of the Game and 50 Cent serves as a permanent, chilling indictment of corporate exploitation. They were two phenomenally talented, fiercely driven men who fought their way out of the darkest, most unforgiving corners of America, only to be thrown into a gladiator arena built by billionaires. They survived the bullets of the streets, but they barely survived the contracts of the boardrooms. The moral lesson of this sprawling, decade-long civil war is as sharp and unforgiving as the bullets that sparked it. In the corporate hierarchy of the entertainment business, authenticity is merely a marketing demographic. Street credibility is just a branding tool. And violence is nothing more than a highly effective catalyst for revenue. 50 Cent and the Game eventually found their peace, secured their immense wealth, and cemented their legendary status, but they had to walk through a decade of corporate-sponsored fire to get there. They learned the hardest, most brutal truth of the capitalist machine. The house always wins, especially when the players are forced to use their own lives as chips.